The Emperor of Mankind, Through the Ages. This is not a story about battles, armies, or empires. Those will come later. This is a story about a single figure moving through deep time, watching, waiting, guiding, and ultimately deciding that humanity cannot be left alone. This video is about the Emperor of Mankind. Not as a god, not as a legend, but as a being who has existed alongside humanity from its earliest steps, shaped by its fears, its hopes, and its repeated failures. To understand this journey, it helps to understand how time is measured in this universe. Events are often recorded by millennia. M1 for the first millennium of human history, M30 for the 30th. These are not dates in the way we know them, but markers of vast ages separated by thousands of years, where entire civilizations can rise, fall, and be forgotten. We will begin long before the Imperium, before Space Marines, before the Golden Throne.
We will explore the myths of his creation, the shamans, the sacrifice, the birth of something unprecedented, and then follow him as humanity grows around him, as civilizations rise and fall, as technology advances faster than wisdom, as the warp changes in response to human emotion and belief. The Emperor is the constant, but the galaxy is not. Across millennia, we will watch humanity leave Earth, spread to the stars, reach a golden age of near limitless power, and then collapse into isolation and madness. We will see what the Emperor did openly and what he did in secret, what he protected, what he allowed to fail, and the terrible compromises he made to ensure survival. This is not a story told from certainty. Much of what we explore exists in fragments, contradictions, and half-remembered legends. That uncertainty is part of the truth. History in this universe is broken, and the Emperor himself may be the most unreliable witness of all. By the end of this journey, we will arrive at the moment when he steps out of the shadows, when patience is no longer possible, when guidance is no longer enough, not because he sought power, but because there were no choices left. He steps forward not to rule humanity, but to prevent its extinction. The Imperium of Man is born not from ambition, but from necessity. A final, terrible effort to hold a fractured species together long enough to survive. This is the story of a man who understood the gods, their malice, their evil, and chose to stand between them and humanity, no matter the cost. Let's begin where Warhammer 40,000 truly begins. Not with humanity, not with the Emperor, not even with the Imperium. It begins with sentience. With words, powers, and entities of creation and unmaking. Powers too old to even have a place in myth and legends. Because the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is not just a place filled with stars and planets. It is a living, psychological system. Thought matters. Emotion matters. Belief matters. What minds think and feel does not stay contained. It bleeds outward into reality itself. And long before humans ever looked up at the night sky, something else understood that truth. Long before Terra had a name, the galaxy was already alive. In the distant, unfathomably ancient past, millions of years before the first human ancestor shaped a stone into a tool, the galaxy was already old. Stars had been born and had died. Worlds had risen and shattered. Entire cycles of creation had already passed. But most importantly, intelligence had already taken root. The earliest great civilization known to exist were beings later remembered as the Old Ones.
They were not gods. But compared to anything that came after them, they might as well have been. The Old Ones were masters of both physical reality and the warp. To them, the warp was not a hellscape of madness or demons. It was a natural force, a medium, a tool, no more inherently dangerous than fire is to a species that understands how to contain and shape it. This is something that cannot be overstated. The warp was not always hostile. In its earliest state, the warp was a relatively calm psychic ocean. It reflected thought and emotion, yes, but it was not dominated by predatory entities. There were no dark gods yet, no great hungering powers. Emotion existed, but it had not yet been weaponized by suffering on a galactic scale. The Old Ones lived in that era of balance. And they did something no species before or since would ever truly replicate. They engineered life. The Old Ones did not merely build machines or cities. They did not simply colonize worlds. They shaped biology itself. They created species carefully tailored to survive, to adapt, and, most importantly, to interact with the warp in very specific ways. They were architects of souls. And among their greatest creations were two species that would define the future of the galaxy. The first were the Eldari. They were designed as psychic conduits, highly intelligent, emotionally intense, and deeply attuned to the warp. Their thoughts carried weight. Their feelings shaped reality. To them, psychic power was not a mutation or a curse. It was as natural as breathing. They were artists of thought, capable of reshaping reality through psychic mastery alone. The second were the Krork. These later devolved into the Orcs of our modern era. Where the Eldari were elegant and foresighted, the Krork were instruments of war. Massive, resilient, endlessly adaptable, and biologically engineered to thrive in constant conflict. They grew stronger through struggle, smarter through war, more dangerous the longer they fought. Living weapons designed to never break. These species were not accidents. They were answers. Because the Old Ones had enemies. Another ancient civilization arose after them, the Necrontyr. Where the Old Ones were long-lived and resilient, the Necrontyr were fragile. Their stars burned them with radiation, their bodies failed early. Their lives were short, painful, and defined by decay. They looked upon the Old Ones with envy, and that envy curdled into hatred. The Necrontyr sought immortality. They begged for it, demanded it, went to war for it. The Old Ones, for reasons unknown, refused. In desperation, the Necrontyr turned to beings of pure cosmic energy,
vast, star-born intelligences that fed on radiation and reality itself. The Catan, for all their godlike power, had already failed once. Alone, they could not overcome the Old Ones. Only together, Necrontyr desperation bound to star-devouring gods, did they become capable of challenging and finally breaking their ancient enemies. These entities promised salvation. They promised eternity. What they delivered instead was not salvation. It was enslavement. The Necrontyr surrendered their souls and became the Necron, immortal machines bound to godlike entities that fed on existence itself. Their bodies were perfected, their minds preserved, but their souls were stripped away. In gaining eternity, they lost everything that made them alive. And with that transformation, the galaxy crossed a line it could never uncross. What followed is remembered as the War in Heaven. It was not simply a war of fleets or armies. It was a war of physics, of souls, of existence itself. Entire regions of the galaxy were erased. Stars were extinguished. Reality itself was rewritten in places. The Necrons wielded technology capable of silencing gods and breaking suns. The Old Ones countered with warp-based weapons and psychic species. The Eldari fought as living conduits of psychic force, bending the warp as naturally as muscle bends bone. The Krork were unleashed as biological engines of annihilation, overwhelming entire systems through sheer violence and adaptation. The scale of destruction is impossible to truly comprehend. But the most important damage was not physical. It was psychic. The warp reflects thought and emotion. And for millions of years, yes, millions of years, the War in Heaven flooded it with fear, rage, despair, hatred, and unimaginable suffering. Emotions on a galactic scale, sustained over epochs. For the first time, the warp began to change. Where once it had been fluid and neutral, it began to develop currents, pressure, predatory echoes. Emotional residues started to cling together, forming patterns. The first warp predators began to emerge. Not gods, not yet, but no longer harmless. This is the critical truth that underpins all of Warhammer 40,000. Chaos was not created by humanity. Humanity inherited a broken warp. By the time the War in Heaven ended, the Old Ones were gone, slain, faded, or retreated beyond reality. The Necrons, at last understanding the terrible cost of their false immortality, turned on the very gods they had served. Through weapons of impossible power, they shattered the Satan into fragments and bound them as shards. Only then did the Necrons entomb themselves in stasis across the galaxy, not as an act of surrender, but of strategy. They calculated that time itself would erode all rivals, and that when they rose again, no living civilization would remain capable of challenging their return. And the Eldari inherited the stars. For millions of years after the War in Heaven, the Eldari dominated the galaxy. They were effectively unchallenged, masters of the webway, lords of psychic art and advanced science. Their civilization reached heights no species would ever match again. During this long age, the warp stabilized somewhat, but it was never healed. It carried scars, echoes, memory. And the Eldari, being deeply psychic, shaped it with every indulgence, every excess, every emotion taken too far. Pleasure, pride, obsession, desire without restraint. Slowly, imperceptibly, they poisoned the sea they swam in. Humanity did not yet exist, and that matters, because while the Eldari ruled the stars, a small, fragile species was evolving on an unremarkable world at the edge of the galaxy. A species with no ancient empire, no engineered destiny. A species that would inherit everything that went wrong. By the time humanity emerged, the galaxy was already damaged beyond repair, scarred by ancient wars, haunted by abandoned gods, defined by a warp forever shaped by violence and excess. Humanity did not create chaos. Humanity walked into a galaxy where chaos was already waiting. And somewhere on Terra, long before history, long before writing, long before civilization, another presence was growing. A soul unlike any other. But that story does not begin with empires or armies. It begins with the shamans of prehistoric humanity. Our very first psychers, with rebirth, with sacrifice, and with the first true answer to a galaxy that had already decided humanity should fail.
Long before recorded history, before there was an emperor, there was fear. Not the fear of enemies or monsters, but a deeper fear, one that lived quietly in the human soul. The fear of death. The fear that existence ended not with meaning, but with silence. Early humanity lived close to the edge of that fear. They hunted, they gathered, they fought, they survived. They buried their dead and looked at the sky, wondering what waited beyond the darkness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, some of them began to hear something whispering back. Long before civilization, before cities, or writing, or kings, certain humans were born different. They dreamed too vividly. They sensed things that were not there. They spoke of places they had never been. They were the first human psychers. These early psychers were not weak by any modern standard. In fact, compared to most psychers of the far future, they were powerful. Not because they wielded lightning or fire, but because they were stable. They lived in a time when the warp, though scarred, was still quieter than it would one day become. There were dangers, yes. Predators lurking in the depths, but the sea had not yet turned into a storm. These psychers became shamans. Not priests in the later sense, not worshippers of gods, but guides, mediators, bridges between the human world and the unseen one. They healed, they advised, they interpreted visions. They carried the spiritual weight of their people, and when they died, something extraordinary happened. They returned. Rebirth was the shaman's greatest secret. When an ordinary human died, their soul drifted briefly in the warp before dissolving, scattering into nothingness. But the shamans were different. Their souls were strong, anchored, cohesive. When they died, they did not fade. They reincarnated. Again and again, across generations. Each lifetime adding memory, wisdom, and strength. Each rebirth refining their understanding of both humanity and the warp. Over thousands of years, these shamans became something rare in the galaxy. A lineage of souls, growing wiser and stronger instead of weaker. They remembered past lives, past mistakes, past triumphs. They carried humanity's earliest collective memory, not in books, but in spirit. And for a time, this worked. Humanity grew. Slowly. Carefully. Watched over by souls that refused to let it fail. But the galaxy does not reward stability forever.
As humanity spread and multiplied, the warp changed. Not because of humanity alone, but because of everything that had come before. The ancient wars, the scars left by gods and star-killers, the echoes of suffering still trapped in the psychic sea. Predators grew bolder. Entities that had once lingered at the edges of the warp began to hunt with intent. They learned. They adapted. They waited for moments of weakness. And eventually, they found one. When a shaman died, their soul no longer traveled safely through the warp. Something else was waiting. At first, it was rare. A shaman would die and not return. Their people would wait for the signs of rebirth, the familiar soul, the remembered eyes, the wisdom returning in a new body. But nothing came. The shamans understood what this meant long before anyone else did. Their souls were being consumed. Not destroyed by chance, but hunted, devoured by entities that fed on consciousness itself. Predators that had learned the value of strong, reincarnating souls. Every rebirth was a beacon, and now the warp was answering. The shamans began to disappear, one by one, each loss weakening humanity's spiritual defense, each death permanent. For the first time since their lineage began, the shamans faced extinction, and with it, humanity faced something far worse. Because without the shamans, humanity would not just lose guidance, it would lose protection. Unchecked psychers would be born without teachers. Visions would turn into madness. Whispers would become commands. The warp would no longer be a distant echo. It would become an open wound. The shamans saw this future clearly. Humanity tearing itself apart. Demons walking freely among the living. Souls screaming into eternity with no one left to guide them. And they understood something else as well. Running was no longer an option. So they gathered. All of them, every remaining shaman, from every culture, every land, every forgotten corner of early terror. Souls who had lived dozens, sometimes hundreds of lifetimes. They came together to debate, to choose a course of action. In the end, they concluded that there was no alternative. Reincarnation was no longer sustainable. Each rebirth fed the predators. Each death strengthened the enemy. The only way forward was unthinkable. They would end the cycle. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. They would die, not separately, but together, at the same moment, in the same ritual. Their souls would not scatter across the warp where they could be hunted. They would merge. Every memory, every lifetime, every fragment of will and identity, compressed into a single, unified soul, strong enough to survive what none of them could endure alone. It would be the last rebirth, and the first of something new. The ritual was not a spell in the later sense. There were no chants to gods, no prayers, no bargains. This was not worship. It was engineering, a deliberate, calculated act of psychic fusion. A mass suicide not born of despair, but of purpose. The shamans did not see it as death. They saw it as transformation. When the moment came, they let go, and the warp trembled. A single soul emerged from the fusion, not fragmented, not diluted, but impossibly dense, layered with thousands of lifetimes, anchored by human will, memory, and purpose. Where the shamans had once reincarnated many times, this soul would be born only once. Into flesh, into time, into history.